From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. 315,000, that's the number of new jobs that were created in the United States of America last month. And by the way, that's more than expected. Also, we saw an uptick in wages as well. And there's real news about the employment market there. To take us through it, welcome now Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. Mike, thanks for being back with us. So if the Fed was looking for some substantial slowdown in the labor market, I'm not sure they got it today.
They sort of did and they sort of didn't. And that's the hard part about this jobs report. It's something for everybody in here. 261,000 jobs in October, 315,000 in September. That's not what the Fed wanted to see, but 3.7% unemployment, that is what the Fed wanted to see, a rise in unemployment. That's not too bad. Average hourly earnings is what they want to see, a drop in the year-over-year rate, but the participation rate falls, which is not something the Fed wants to see. So does it really matter? One of the questions about the Fed and the jobs report is how will they affect the elections next week? Joe Biden has a couple of plans he's talked about to improve the economy. And so we looked at the jobs that would fall under his semiconductor and infrastructure plans and his desire to see more oil drilling. Manufacturing, he's getting some traction there. 32,000 jobs, that's up. But semiconductors, only 2,400 jobs. Oil and gas extraction, he wants more drilling. They can't find the employees, only 400. And heavy construction and engineering, well, maybe the infrastructure construction hasn't started yet. Only 400 jobs lost in that category. What does it all mean? Well, the Fed could take either explanation, good news or bad news, but we've got another jobs report and 3 inflation reports before then. So at the moment, the markets have priced down a Fed move to just 5%. We went into the day ahead of this jobs report with about 5.25%.
Well, the markets didn't know quite what to make of those numbers, as I recall. They went all over the place. But to get into the weeds here a little bit, you mentioned that the unemployment rate has actually ticked up a little bit. Could you just explain briefly about the household survey versus the establishment survey? Because I get really confused.
Yeah, there are two surveys. The establishment survey is the one that shows us 261,000 jobs. And the Labor Department surveys 400,000 different companies across the nation for that. The household survey is the one where they call you up and ask you, are you employed and how many hours did you work this month? And that's the one that they get the unemployment rate from, but that's only 50,000 people, so the error band is a lot wider. And in that one, they found that we had 302,000 jobs eliminated, and the number of people working fell by 368,000. So that's why the unemployment rate went up.
But if pushed, you'd go with the establishment one.
Yeah, well, there is a way to sort of combine the two under the same methodology, and it shows smaller job gains, but we're still adding people.
Okay. Thank you so much to Michael McKee for taking us through those jobs numbers. And now we turn to Nathan Sheets. He is CITI Global Chief Economist. Nathan, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. So give us your reaction to what you saw in these jobs numbers today.
I read this as a very strong labor market report. I think we're seeing further evidence of resilience in hiring. My sense on the unemployment rate is, yeah, it ticked up, but it's kind of been in this range of 3.5% to 3.75% for a while. And broadly speaking, that's where I think it's going to stay, which is very, very tight labor market conditions. Moreover, the wage gains in this report were very solid, the 0.4. And I think if there's anything that the Fed was looking at beyond the headline number of 261, it's the behavior of wages, and no sign of slowing there. So I think when Jay Powell and his colleagues see this report, it confirms their sense that they're going to be moving vigorously. and that inflation is not abating, likely to abate anytime soon.
So, Nathan, I'm curious about exactly that, the Fed reaction to this. We did hear from Chair Jay Powell earlier this week, as you say. Would he change anything he said if he had to do over again now, or did he actually in some ways anticipate what we saw today?
I don't think Powell would change a word in his press conference. He warned us that the labor market was strong and is likely to remain strong for quite some time. I think the reality is, and the implication of that, is that the Fed is going to have to hike until the labor market breaks. And I think that that's going to require substantial further rate hikes. Again, as Powell signaled in his press conference, we've recently marked up our expectations at CITI for Fed rate hikes and now see the terminal Fed funds rate as somewhere in the mid-5s.
So, Nathan, why is the labor market so resilient? And for that matter, why is inflation so tough to get at?
My sense is that the resilience of the labor market is tied fundamentally to what's going on with the consumer. During the pandemic, we purchased a lot of goods and we were nervous about buying services. And what's happened as some of the health risks have dissipated is households in particular are substituting back towards services. And that strong services demand is also bringing with it a lot of strength in the labor market, because firms need to respond, and those services sectors are relatively labor intensive. So I think at the end of the day, what's driving this economy, the key engine here is that relationship between services demand in the consumer sector and its implications for the labor market and wages. And that's just a very strong dynamic that has not yet really shown a lot of signs of easing up.
Well, in terms of signs of easing up, how much of that is because of the savings the consumers' households had in store and that they're continuing to spend? And are we getting a sense when they might be through that?
Well, part of it is solid wage growth, coupled with real wages are not keeping up with inflation. But if you add in the income that households are receiving by having more people work, these ongoing job gains, overall incomes are broadly staying up with inflation. So part of this strength is a reflection of the tight labor market, wages, employment, and the like. Over and above that, David, as you indicate, there is also a substantial war chest of funding that households have. That's money that they didn't spend during the pandemic. It's some of the savings as a result of the checks that were sent and other kinds of stimulus during the pandemic. That's been drawn down a little bit, but it's still substantial and could support consumer spending for quite some time to come.
Okay, Nathan, thank you so much for being back with us. Really appreciate it. That's Nathan Sheets. He is CITI Global Chief Economist. Coming up, we're going to talk with Republican Representative Patrick McHenry of North Carolina about the jobs numbers and the midterm elections. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Lisa Mateo here with the first word.
Thank you, David. Well, U.S. employers added more jobs than expected last month. Payrolls rose 261,000 in October, following an upwardly revised 315,000 gain in September. And that underscores the strength of the labor market despite the Fed's aggressive efforts to cool it down. The unemployment rate, well, that rose to 3.7% as participation declined. In Pakistan, Imran Khan's party has called for nationwide protests on Friday after a shooting at a rally injured the former prime minister. He will address the nation at 6 p.m. local time. The ex-cricket star has blamed Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, the interior minister, and a top general from the intelligence agency for the attack on his rally in the eastern Punjab province. Single-family rental company American Homes for Rent expects its Texas property taxes will jump more than 20% this year. That's according to an earnings release Thursday. Now, rival Invitation Homes said last week that its tax bill this year will climb 7 to 8% due to higher costs in areas such as Florida and Georgia. Smaller landlords are also feeling the elevated property tax burdens. And Kyrie Irving, the point guard for the Brooklyn Nets, has apologized after being suspended to, quote, disavow anti-Semitism. Irving will sit out for 5 games without pay. On Instagram, Irving said, quote, to all Jewish families and communities that are hurt and affected from my post, I am deeply sorry to have caused you pain, and I apologize. I had no intentions to disrespect any Jewish cultural history regarding the Holocaust or perpetuate any hate. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Well, as we've been talking about, we got the jobs numbers out for the month of October in the United States, and they were strong, stronger than expected, which means a lot of people have jobs who need them. To get a reaction out of those jobs numbers, we turn to Republican Representative Patrick McHenry of North Carolina. He is the ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being back with us. So whatever you think about the Biden administration and their administration of the economy, you have to give them some credit on the jobs, don't you?
Sure. And look, the job numbers today are a complicated picture of where America stands today. We have, a lower rate, but participation is down. But what we see on the ballot at the ballot box on Tuesday is really a referendum on the Biden economy. When the average American is paying dramatically more for everything they buy, that's what they're thinking about, not a headline jobs number. The experience of the average American in this economy is one that they don't like and they give a failing grade to. That is really the dominant factor in our politics today and what I'm hearing from my constituents.
So let's talk about the ballot box on Tuesday, just 4 days away. We don't know how it's going to come out. I certainly don't know how it's going to come out, but a lot of people are projecting it may well be that Republicans like yourself will actually be in the majority. If that happens and you do have leadership of the Financial Services Committee, what will be your first priority be? What's your first initiative?
Well, legislative initiatives and oversight initiatives are two different things. So when it comes to oversight, exposing this administration's failures in regulatory policy that have driven up the price of things for average Americans is front and center for our agenda. So oversight of the administration and a deep discussion, a serious conversation about the inflationary impacts of their policies. And then legislatively, I think we have opportunities. We have opportunities to answer those key questions American people are raising and trying to give a hopeful view for the future. So I think a focus on capital formation and giving people more opportunities for new and diverse investment opportunities and helping small businesses grow and expand will be number one. Number two, giving clarity to the digital asset ecosystem. And number three, updating our data privacy standards. So an agenda focused on innovation and in a view to an optimistic future in response to the great deal of pessimism we see today in the American body politic.
Congressman, I'm curious about the oversight function you said is number one, which is to some extent looking backwards and figuring out what went wrong. Is there a risk for Republicans that they spent 2 years basically doing investigations and oversight? The American public will say, well, what did you do for us? What did we get out of that?
Well, it's not necessarily in the rearview mirror. This is the active set of regulations we have working through the Securities and Exchange Commission, the CFPB, and the regulatory policies of this administration. Those things, those are items that they tried to legislate here on Capitol Hill and failed to succeed on, and so they're proceeding at pace to get through regulation that which they could not get through legislation. Take, for instance, climate. Instead of getting the Green New Deal passed through Congress, which they didn't have the votes to do, even with Democrats in charge, they're pursuing through regulatory fiat climate obligations on public and private companies through securities regulation. So we're going to highlight the cost of those regulations to the average American and the average small business person and the impact that has on our economy. That's an active conversation and an active response to their active rulemaking. And I think it's necessary for us to adhere to the constitutional precepts of separation of powers And in those separations of power, in that separation of power, we have an oversight function for Congress that is really important that we focus on.
Congressman, before we get to the new Congress, of course, though, there's some of the old Congress left. I wonder about the so-called lame duck session, what we might expect. Let me ask the big one, which is the debt ceiling. There's a lot of talk about that. You don't have to get it done then, but it will be coming up in the new year without a doubt. Is there a prospect that you could actually take care of that so that we don't have to run up against the possibility of default?
Yes, and I think that would be good for our economy, and that would be good for our fiscal management of a very expensive federal government that we have now, with a Treasuries market the largest it's ever been in human history, and with the serious implications for economic stability that come as a result of this massive new debt load in a changing economy. So I think it would provide the clarity and the financial stability that is very important for us to have as a global leader and as the most powerful nation and most powerful economy in the world.
So fair enough on the debt ceiling. That's the big one, as I say. There are some other things that are kicking around, if I can put it that way, that might or might not make it in the lame duck. What about the so-called SAFE Act, which, as I understand it, has to do with cannabis banking?
That's right. The Safe Banking Act. Ed Perlmutter and David Joyce have been big leaders of this in the House of Representatives, one Republican, one Democrat. And the word that I've given to them, the commitment I've made, is that as long as they adhere to the bill that we passed out of the House, I would support it getting enacted into law on another bill, whether it's the end-of-year spending package or the National Defense Authorization Act. We had over 70% of the House of Representatives voted for this fix, so that those legal businesses and states across the country can access the banking system. But as a part of that, you had a significant amount of compromise with Republicans to get a large majority in the House of Representatives. I think that is the bill that needs to become law, not the things that they're kicking around trying to add to it or delete from it.
Okay, Congressman, really appreciate you being with us. Always, I know you've got a busy weekend ahead of you in front of those midterm elections. Thank you so much for being with us. That's Republican Representative Patrick McHenry of North Carolina. Coming up, we're going to take a look at how Republicans are spending their campaign dollars in the 4 days before the midterms with Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC Communications Director. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Season is here.
The earnings are starting to pour in.
The numbers are holding up better than expected.
Sorry, business isn't all that bad.
Bloomberg breaks the numbers first.
Netflix earnings going to cross the wire.
A big beat. Stock is up more than 8%. Coming in stronger than their rivals.
With exclusive expert analysis.
Finally back to growth.
The mother of all opportunities.
What is the industry to watch?
That's where the rubber hits the road for Goldman Sachs.
It's going to be a really interesting earnings season.
Bloomberg Television and Radio. The fastest numbers and analysis you trust.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. 4 days to go until those midterm elections with a lot of campaigning left to go and a lot of spending on various advertisers. I suspect everybody watching this has seen a few of them on their local television channel. To take us through exactly what the Republican strategy might be on these last 4 days, we turn now to Republican strategist Lisa Camooso Miller, who served as communications director for the Republican National Committee. So, Lisa, thank you so much for being with us. Give us a sense of what, if you were at the RNC right now, you'd be doing in allocating money to different races.
Well, David, we are, when we think about late ad buys, we should think about buying late airline tickets because it's expensive and you don't necessarily get to sit where you want to be. But the truth of it is that money that's being invested now at in these last days is really to help motivate those that haven't made up their minds. The base has obviously made their choice on both sides, R's and D's. So there are really the votes that are up for grabs now are those folks that have not decided or have not been fully persuaded. And that is amazing to me that we are at this late game in a midterm election, and numbers are estimated to be $1.5 billion or more in advertising this year alone.
It's extraordinary. So again, if you're allocating all the Republican funds, are you focused on the Senate or the House? I mean, a lot of people think the House is likely to go to the Republicans anyway. Do you focus on the Senate to make sure you get that?
Well, I think that their focus is on very, very strategic races that are close, where we know that we're within striking distance. And I don't just think it's House and Senate. The interesting part about the ballot this year is that there are also governors on the ticket, right, that are really at the top of the ballot itself. So it will be in states where we think we can make change from the top to the bottom. It'll be places where we're seeing movement in the polls. I absolutely know that the House will turn to a Republican-controlled House, but I also think over the course of the last couple of weeks, the Senate has really narrowed, and I think that it will most likely be that Republicans will take that body as well.
So does that mean, like everyone says, we're really talking about Pennsylvania and we're talking about Georgia and maybe Arizona?
That's correct. That's right. Yeah, we're paying very close attention. And sometimes in states like New Hampshire, where we're seeing some movement that was not expected to be movement at all. So it's a really interesting time. It's a time when people narrow. But the game really now, because you're seeing these polls are so close, David, that there really now is the push to get out the vote, to get those people that haven't made up their minds, or maybe those folks who are sitting on the fence, to try to connect with them. The other thing, too, David, is that 50% of that $1.5 billion is still being spent in broadcast alone. And that's not necessarily where voters are, right? They're on streaming platforms. They're on social platforms. So the money is really, really spread out. And right now at the last minute, it's very expensive.
Left over from what some was called the good old days, when broadcast was really where it all happened. So Lisa, finally, there's a lot of talk about election deniers. There are a lot of election deniers on the ballots, particularly in state races you identified, governors and secretaries of state right now. Is that affecting the money raising?
I think it is affecting the money raising. In fact, what's so interesting is I sat with a member of Congress and his staff yesterday and actually was getting a sense of what is happening behind the scenes as it relates to fundraising. And the truth of it is that many of these members, a lot of them Republican members, were surprised at how their numbers are down this year because of corporate decisions that were made not to give this year. So there's going to be a lot of bloodletting after the elections, in addition to the fact that there very well could be some elections where there are contests that are within striking distance. And that's where more money will be spent.
Fascinating. Do you think there may be a change going forward in denying the elections?
Well, I like to think that the states that have to certify those are being extra cautious, and they're doing everything in their power to make sure that they are crystal clear about how elections are being conducted, how they are being counted, and they're going to be very, very careful to make sure that they're transparent and clear about how decisions are made.
We can certainly all hope for that. Thank you so much. That's public affairs strategist Lisa Camooso Miller. And we note that Michael R. Bloomberg, he's the founder and majority owner of our parent company, has been a major donor to Democratic candidates and causes this election cycle. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group about what difference the midterm elections could make for U.S. foreign policy. There are a lot of things at stake right now up on Capitol Hill. Could this make a difference? This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome back. You're watching Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Guy Johnson in London. We're wrapping up the session. We're wrapping up the week here in Europe. The close is upon us. Let's talk about what has happened here, because today Europe has looked east, not west. It's all been about China. Yeah, the payrolls were interesting, but I don't think they changed very much. The China reopening story, or rumors of that reopening, certainly having a huge catalyst on European assets today, delivering a huge catalyst. This is the picture. You can see bright green across the whole of the continent. The FTSE 100's outperforming, but the DAX has had a good day. The CAC 40 has had a good day. What you're seeing here is the China effect into the commodity space, into the luxury space, into the automotive space, into the banking space. And that has been the narrative. So the way that the session has developed has been one that came out of Asia rather than coming out of the United States. You've also seen a huge effect on the currencies today. Commodity currencies have done incredibly well. So a quick look at what the session looks like for the Stock 600 today, just to give you an idea of what we've been looking at. We've basically been rising throughout most of the day as we priced in that story. In fact, we've rolled over off our highs on the back of the payroll data that we saw out of the United States. We're trading 417. We're up by nearly 2% today on the Stock 600. Let me just show you a couple of other assets which I think are instructive and useful to understand why we've seen the session that we've seen here in Europe today. So the dollar is under pressure, and that's being driven by Chinese currency strength today. You can really see that. And that's then rippled through into some of the European currencies. The Norwegian kroner's had a very solid day today. The euro's had a pretty good day today as well. But it's the commodity currencies that are really benefiting, really being driven by that Chinese currency story. It's then rippled through into the Brent complex. Look at what is happening there. Brent is off its earlier highs. We're tracking towards 100. We're up by 3.2% right now. And copper, the LME contract, look at that, up by over 7%. So what that has meant from a sector point of view has been that you have seen the commodities really outperforming. So look at the basic resources. That is the mining sector here in Europe. It's up by 5.6%. But the next sector is the luxury sector. If China reopens, it's going to be names like Kering and LVMH that are going to do really well here. The car sector's done well, retail's done well. The only sector that is in negative territory today is healthcare. Basically, the more defensive end of the market has underperformed today. The China reopening trade has been absolutely front and center. Let me show you some single stocks just to give you an idea of what that looks like here in Europe. LVMH up by 5.5%. Anglo-American, the mining company, up by 12% today. There are a few idiosyncratic single stock stories that are worth focusing on their own merit. Adidas is certainly one of those. Adidas, as you guys call it, of course. That stock trading up over 20% today. Now, there's always been crosstown rivalry between Puma and Adidas, but it looks like the Puma CEO, the Norwegian, is going to be going potentially to Adidas, taking over from Kasper Rorsted. That's given that stock a huge lift. Stateside, this is the picture. We are off our earlier highs, 37.32. We're up by around 0.4% on the S&P. The US 2-year, you can see there we're catching a bit, so yields are coming lower, which is interesting after the payroll number. The dollar, as you've already described, very much under pressure today. And US mining stocks doing very, very well. Freeport, as you can see, up nearly 10% today on the back of that China reopening trade. So to be honest, David, I think what we've seen today is a payroll number that didn't really change anything, but the catalyst has really come from China. This is the last time I'll do this week. Obviously, the clock's changed. Remember that. David Weston, back to you.
And we will miss you, Guy Johnson. And brought it back to China. I understand. The payrolls actually did have an effect here for a time, but then they settled back down. And by the way, we are learning to pronounce it Adidas, as well as aluminium. We're working really hard on it, Guy. Thank you so much. It was great having you with us all week long. And now we're going to turn to what that midterm elections 4 days from now could mean for foreign policy. Normally we think of that as mainly an executive branch function, but there are some things up on Capitol Hill that could make a difference. And we bring in now Ian Bremmer. He's founder and president of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Ian, thank you so much for being with us. So give us a sense of what difference it could make. And let me start with one that has been talked about a fair amount already, which is support for Ukraine. As you know, we had Kevin McCarthy make that statement about maybe it wouldn't be a blank check. Other Republicans are saying maybe we'll be a little more careful how we spend the money. Could it make a difference for U.S. support of Ukraine?
Not really. Of all the things out there, I don't see much of a change. If you talk to both Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, there is an overwhelmingly strong level of support for Ukraine and anger at Russia. You can find some progressive Democrats that are unhappy about the amount of money that's being spent. You can find some MAGA Republicans that will say the same thing. But when I look at 2023, between the extension of the existing Lend-Lease policy that Biden has been using to get the Ukrainians more military material, I look at how much money can be allocated from the Congress that is in place right now for the year of 2023, as well as the willingness of the Republicans that will be in office in what will almost certainly be a Republican-led House. I just don't see that shift very much. More broadly, as you look towards the 2024 election, I could potentially see Trump as he seeks the nomination to try to undermine that. But that is not an impact directly of what we're going to see next week.
Well, fair enough. I was just going to ask that question. If, in fact, Donald Trump does announce it, now looks increasingly likely will happen perhaps as soon as the week after the midterms. Yep. He basically has not been very supportive at all of Ukraine, has he?
No, he's not. Of course, he dragged his feet, and that was behind one of his two impeachments was the effort to pressure the Ukrainians and take away their Javelin missiles the U.S. was supposed to send if they weren't willing to open an investigation into Biden and his son. Certainly, he did come out at the beginning of the war and say, well, this isn't the Putin that I knew, recognizing that his willingness to engage with Vladimir Putin on the global stage was potentially a problem for him and out of step with the rest of his party. But clearly, Trump is going to be a personal outlier on Russia and Ukraine and on the person of Vladimir Putin as he becomes a more significant player in the Republican race for the presidency. So I think that's a much more significant shift. And whether or not that brings with it MAGA Republicans as a whole, whether it brings with it some of the loyalists. I've seen people like Lindsey Graham, who is very strong pro-Trump, but on Russia, Ukraine has been very strong pro-Ukraine. And I suspect this is not going to be a top priority for Trump, at least in the initial weeks and months of his campaign.
Ian, let me ask you about something I never thought I would ask you about, and that is support on Capitol Hill for Israel. Because we have now a new government coming into form in Israel that has some fairly extreme elements, at least people describe it as very extreme elements. You probably saw Tom Friedman in the New York Times today saying if they go far enough, it could actually raise some questions about support for Israel on Capitol Hill. Is that plausible to you?
I guess it's plausible. I mean, look, the fact is that Netanyahu is not a stranger to Capitol Hill, and he works Washington extremely effectively. But he's responding to big corruption charges inside Israel, which has damaged his brand to a bit. He also has within his coalition, and every Israeli government is a coalition, and they all run by just a few seats in the majority in the Knesset. So you don't get big majorities in Israel. Well, part of his government is, an anti-rule of law, far-right party, kind of a Meir Kahane sort of ideology. And that would be a very serious change in how we think about Israel, that component of the government. And to the extent that some of those more skeptical of Israel are starting to promote that inside the United States, I think it will be more controversial, the level of engagement. I also think the Abraham Accords, which are one of the biggest notable foreign policy successes of the Trump administration, I could easily see the United Arab Emirates deciding that they're not going to engage with Israel the way they have as a consequence of this government and some of its ideology. So I do think there's some play there, but on balance, I suspect it will be still the strongest ally of the United States in the Middle East.
Ian, we never like to let you get away without talking about China. We know Olaf Scholz has been over from Germany visiting with President Xi in China. There's been some talk about maybe use of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, at least for some expatriates. And now we have rumors of reopening in China. Is there any basis that you're aware of that rumors for reopening? Because the markets are certainly reacting to it.
Yeah, they reacted quickly, and then they backed off when it was pretty clear that actually what we're seeing on the ground in China is still a very significant expansion of cases. And though the lockdowns are targeted, they're still shutting you down, whether it's Foxconn or whether it's Shanghai Disneyland. The last 48 hours has been really problematic for the way we think about the Chinese marketplace. Now, I do believe that over the coming year, we're going to see an effort to make, with surveillance technology they have, the response to breakouts being more targeted, in other words, neighborhoods as opposed to cities, as well as shorter term with the ability to get out of lockdown in only a few days as opposed to a couple of weeks. That's going to help. But they still don't have the kind of vaccines that would be able to effectively stop this disease from spreading. And they still believe right now, post Xi Jinping's Party Congress, they still believe that they do not have the hospital capacity to respond to serious outbreaks of cases. In other words, they'd be overwhelmed in major second-tier cities, not just the hinterlands, if they start allowing zero COVID to really unwind. So I still think that the message for the markets in 2023 is this is a very serious inefficiency in how we think about China.
Ian, it's always so great to have you with us. It's really helpful. Thank you. That's Ian Bremmer. He's founder and president of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Coming up, we're going to go to the White House for a reaction to today's jobs numbers with Heather Boushey of the Council of Economic Advisors. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We got jobs numbers out for the month of October in the United States of America, and they were strong today from just about every point of view. To take us through the view from the White House, we welcome now Dr. Heather Boushey. She's a member of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors. So, Dr. Boushey, thank you so much for being with us. Give us your best take on what you see in these numbers and therefore what the president sees.
Well, certainly this is a good report for American families. It shows that the economy continued to add jobs at that steady pace that we really want to see. Added about 261,000 jobs last month. And, while the pace is down relative to a year ago, where we were adding over 500,000 jobs per month on average, that in and of itself is good news. It means that we're getting to the kind of economy that can be sustainable. And it means that we are continuing to add jobs. So that is good news. The job gains were quite widespread across most industries, and that's also quite significant. One thing that really popped out for us this month was the large gains in manufacturing. The gains in manufacturing jobs in the United States has been larger than in any previous recovery in decades. We've added over 700,000 manufacturing jobs since the president took office and have over 137 some odd more than we did pre-pandemic. So that's good news. And it's also a testament to the president's policies. Just since the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law, we've seen over $28 billion of investment in manufacturing across the United States in clean energy, in electric vehicles, and batteries, and solar. And I think you see some of that starting to be reflected in the kind of economy we're seeing right now.
So, Dr. Boushey, we at Bloomberg, maybe other places as well, we play almost a little game about when is good news bad news and bad news good news. Obviously, it's good news that a lot more people have jobs. At the same time, you and the president have said fighting inflation is your number one priority. Is there some bad news in these numbers in that this indicates the labor market is so robust, the Federal Reserve is going to have to keep raising rates, we're going to have to pay more for borrowing money?
Well, I can't comment on Fed policy, but what I can tell you is, on the one hand, it is always a good thing when Americans get jobs, and so that is unequivocal good news. We do want to see that pace slowing. We have seen it slow considerably, so that goes in the good news category. There are two surveys that come out on Jobs Day, and in one of them that asks households about their labor force participation and employment outcomes. We did see a little bit of an uptick in unemployment, and so that makes us a little bit wary and does indicate, though, that things are slowing a bit. Of course, all these numbers move around from month to month, and we're really looking at the trends. So overall, we're looking for this steady economy that we can sustain, and I think we see a lot of indications of that in this report.
Why is inflation so stubborn? At least it looks stubborn to me at this point. I think a lot of people think it's pretty stubborn. Why is it? As an economist, what's your analysis? Because that might inform about when it's going to turn around.
Certainly. The president does understand that inflation is a very pressing issue. But certainly his entire economic team understands that is why he has been so focused on doing what he can to lower inflation. Of course, we're here because of the global pandemic. The United States is not the only country that is experiencing very high inflation. We're about in the middle of the pack compared to many of our economic competitors. So it's a global phenomena. And of course, one of the big triggers was Putin's unprovoked war in the Ukraine that upended global energy markets. And now that has been going on for quite some time, some of those costs are working their way through the economy. So it isn't just energy prices, but all the other things in the economy that use energy that now cost more. Certainly this is a problem, but that is why the Inflation Reduction Act was so important to the president. Now, focusing on the specific pain points that he could address around prescription drugs, healthcare, and of course, moving us to clean energy. These are all ways that we can address some of the economic challenges facing families, even as we do what we can to lower inflation overall.
So, Dr. Boushey, as you say, you're not responsible for the Federal Reserve. You're also not responsible, as far as I know, for the political shop at the White House. At the same time, we do have midterm elections coming up on Tuesday. And a big issue is going to be inflation. And a lot of Republicans are using that. And this is my really simplistic question. Why isn't it possible to just admit, yes, we have some inflation, but in part it's because we did invest a lot of money to keep everybody in work? Because if we think back 2 years ago, we did not have such a healthy jobs position. Why can't the White House just admit that?
Well, here's the thing. When the president came into office, his number one goal was to contain the pandemic, get things under control, and get people back to work. For the vast majority of Americans, they get the vast majority of their income from having a job. That's the foundation of economic security. That is what we focused on. And again, the inflation is not just happening here in the United States. It's happening in all other countries that did not implement the same policies that we did. So we really do need to look to the challenges across the supply chains that we've seen. And again, the president has done so much to get those supply chains back up and running again after the pandemic. The amount of time that goods are taking to get from ships onto store shelves is now back to pre-pandemic levels. That's a remarkable achievement. And that is part of the work that happens to lower cost-facing families. But, the president has been focused on this. But of course, we do have to acknowledge that the Inflation Reduction Act was something that he had to do not in a bipartisan way. And yet that is something that is reducing costs for families on healthcare and energy prices.
Dr. Boushey, we really always appreciate you joining us. And for those of you on radio, you can't see that beautiful fall shot outside the White House. It's really good to have you. That's Dr. Heather Boushey. She's a member of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors. Coming up, as voters go to the polls in Ohio, how does trade figure into their thinking? We're going to talk with Bloomberg Editor-in-Chief Emeritus Matt Winkler. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. 4 days away from the midterms, we're going to turn now to Ohio and both the politics and the economics of Ohio. Matt Winkler, Bloomberg Editor-in-Chief Emeritus, has written a terrific column on the Bloomberg about this very subject, and we welcome him back now. So, Matt, it's a fascinating take on exactly what globalization and trade has made for Ohio, because it's sort of a bad word in a lot of Ohio.
Yeah, and contrary to what the candidates are saying and really what is in the media because of what the candidates are saying, globalization has really benefited Ohio. And the proof of that is there are almost 800 factories, foreign factories in Ohio. And Ohio is the #1 state if you measure it by factories per 1,000 square miles. Think about that, #1. And of course, you've heard of some of these companies like Honda, Siemens, Air Liquide. These are big companies and high-paying jobs, no less.
And to some extent, government, like the Ohio state government, has made a conscious decision to entice those people to come in. It's a government decision to encourage this.
We're talking about a race to succeed Rob Portman. You may forget he negotiated 30 trade agreements in his time as the trade representative for the U.S. With Mexico, with Canada, with China, and so on. So this notion that globalization has somehow been bad for Ohio. In fact, Ohio's relative prosperity is a lot greater than it otherwise would be had it not been seeking business from the world.
So, Matt, you always go through the numbers. With Shinpei, you go through the numbers, and that's one of the great strengths is there are actually dollars and cents we can take a look at. But give me an answer to this. In Ohio, with respect to globalization, but more broadly, why do the numbers not speak as loudly as some of the really vivid rhetoric?
Okay, so numbers and data are not, shall I say, particularly sexy.
Except when you present them.
To politicians. And also, by the way, the truth is often complicated. And when anything gets complicated, it's not an easy, if you like, assignment for politics. But the truth is that going all the way back to really the 80s, Ohio has been on a tear courting, recruiting business overseas. And whether you're talking about publicly traded Procter & Gamble, which is the biggest company in Ohio, okay, or you're talking about, say, a family-owned company called Panacea, which is based in Columbus, does all kinds of homeware stuff, they all do trade with the world, and they have to, because if people want certain things. And let me give you another example. Walmart is the #1 employer in Ohio, okay? 55,000 associates work for Walmart, almost $18 an hour on average, all right? It's the #1 employer in Ohio. Guess where Walmart gets most of its product? Overseas.
Exactly right. Exactly
Overseas.
Right. But for those trade agreements. At the same time, the Biden administration has not been very enthusiastic about trade agreements.
No, but, we can't do without them. That's the whole point is that, when we went through this whole process with NAFTA, we realized in the case of Ohio, Canada and Mexico are vital to Ohio. If you don't have a NAFTA agreement, you don't have business with your most important trading partners, and that hurts Ohioans. So it's very difficult, to reconcile the xenophobia with the reality, and the reality is that Ohioans really depend on the world.
It's a terrific column. I recommend it to everybody. By our Bloomberg editor-in-chief emeritus, he is Matt Winkler. And this is Bloomberg.